In this video lecture, we're going to cover the step-by-step method of translation. This is going to be a method that is really helpful for translating English sentences into first-order logic, where the English sentences might have multiple quantifiers, especially if they are mixed quantifiers. That can be a pretty daunting task if, for example, we want to have a sentence that looks like this. No cube to the right of a tetrahedron is to the left of a larger dodecahedron. That's a really complicated sentence, and it's going to be extremely difficult to try to translate that into first-order logic all in one go. So the step-by-step method of translation is going to help us do this in a step-by-step method. It's going to be worth taking a brief minute to just remind you that when it comes to a sentence of English, they are broken down into a noun phrase and a verb phrase. So sentences consist of a noun phrase and a verb phrase. So the way to think about this is in just about every English sentence, you're going to have the one part of the sentence, typically the first part of the sentence, that describes what the subject matter or the subject of the sentence is going to be. And then the verb phrase is predicating on that subject, right? They're saying something about that. You'll notice that in first order logic, right, we often have this type of structure where we have the predicate, might be left of, and then we have two argument positions, right, A and B. These are two names. So the subject of the sentence concerns A and B, and then the predicate is left of. So if we look at an English sentence, say something like, the man in the hat is sitting on the bench. The noun phrase here is the man in the hat. That is the subject of that sentence. And the verb phrase is sitting on the bench. Right? So we have a complex phrase, but it's nevertheless a type of predication. And then we also have a subject, which is also a complex phrase, right? Because we're providing a description of there is a man that is also wearing a hat, and then we're saying something of that particular subject. So the point here is just that we can break the sentence down into the noun phrase and the verb phrase, and those phrases themselves might be more complex. But as a starting place, we can always break down an English sentence into these two components. So think about what is the subject of a sentence, even if it's complex, and what is the predication of that subject, again, even if it's complex. So having in mind the sort of difference between a verb phrase and a noun phrase, let's look at an English sentence that we want to translate into first order logic. And the example that we get in the text that we're using is each cube is to the left of a tetrahedron. What you'll notice if we think about this English sentence in terms of its noun phrase and the verb phrase, the noun phrase is each cube, and then we have as the verb phrase is to the left of a tetrahedron. So the way that we're going to translate this is to actually just start with the noun phrase. That's going to be the first step in our translation. And then what we're going to do is just treat the verb phrase as a single unit. So we'll literally just pretend like we're going to take that as a single unit and copy that into a partially translated sentence in first order logic. So the way we would talk about the noun phrase is we would have each cube. So each here is a universal quantified sentence. And we're saying something that any object that satisfies the condition of being a cube is, and then we're going to say something else about it. The way that we translate universally quantified sentences, recall, is by using the material conditional. So if we look at each cube, we're going to need a universal quantifier out front, and then we're going to say that the variable is a cube. We're going to put that in the antecedent of the conditional, and then we're going to take this whole unit and put that as the consequent. So it'll look something like this. So we've got our universal quantifier out front. So we're saying for all x, when x meets the condition of being a cube, then this verb phrase. So again, what we've done here is translated the noun phrase, each cube, in terms of a partially translated universally quantified sentence, where what we've done is left the consequent of this conditional to be the verb phrase. Okay, so that's the first step. The second step is to now think about how do we translate this x is to the left of a tetrahedron. How do we do that type of translation? Well, for starters, we're going to pretend that this instance of x is like a name, right? It's not actually a name, right? It's a variable, and it's going to have to be bound by a quantifier. And if we look at the logical sentence up here, we'll see that this instance of x is in fact bound by this quantifier, this universal quantifier out front. But for the sake of just thinking about how we would translate this verb phrase, x is to the left of a tetrahedron, let's just for the moment pretend that x is a name. So if we think about how we would translate, say, b is to the left of a tetrahedron, you'll notice now that there is another quantifier in here to the left of a tetrahedron, right? So there's actually another quantifier inside this verb phrase. So if we replaced, say, the x with a name, then we would have something like there exists a y such that y is a tetrahedron, and if we had b as x, b is to the left of y. And then if we think about what b was in the first place, we're like, oh, it was just a variable. So the translation here would look something like this, right? When we say b is to the left of a tetrahedron, the way we would translate that is, okay, there exists a y such that y satisfies the condition of being a tetrahedron, and b is to the left of y, and now all we're doing is taking b, which we had as temporarily substituted for x, right? We're now going to change it back to x. We know that this is now, this sentence here is not strictly speaking a complete sentence because x isn't bound by a particular quantifier out front. But that aside, right, this would be a correct translation of the verb phrase, x is to the left of tetrahedron. So now we have a way of translating this verb phrase from the original sentence that we had. So what we'll do is now replace that verb phrase with the translation that we've provided for it. So what we end up having is this complete sentence, which looks like this, right? For all x, if x is a cube, right? If x is a cube, then there is at least one y, such that y is a tetrahedron, and x is left of that y. So this now gives us the translation of the English sentence that we wanted. Each cube is to the left of a tetrahedron. When you think about, or when you're practicing how to do these translations, the key part, again, is to identify what the noun phrase is and what the verb phrase is, and to separate those into two different steps. So what you're going to see in your exercises is these halfway translations. They're not quite complete, but what they're demonstrating is that you can provide a formal translation of at least the noun phrase component, and then just treat the verb phrase component as a separate unit, and then go ahead and translate that. As one brief additional note, if you wanted to, we could change this phrase, this logical translation. We could actually take the existential quantifier and we could actually move it inside right here to have it be in what we call premix form, right? So this is where all the quantifiers are out front and at the beginning of the sentence. So we could, for example, actually afterwards take this and put it out here, and the sentence would still mean the same thing. Note that I did not put the existential quantifier out in front, right? Like in before the universal quantifier. The reason for that has to do with the order in which quantifiers appear and the difference in meanings. So if you are confused about that, go back to the lecture on mixed quantifiers, where we cover the important difference between the order of the appearance of the quantifiers. Okay, so that covers the first example or the sort of basic idea behind the step-by-step method of translation.